Hello everyone, welcome to a new chess video. Make sure to save this video because it's going to become one of your favorites on the entire YouTube platform. I'm going to teach you how to play the French defense in all its variations. That is, once you've finished watching this video, you'll be more than ready to start playing the French defense. And no one will be able to surprise you with any variation. Alright? What is the French defense? Chess teacher. When our opponent plays the king's pawn, e4, we play e6. For those who have no idea what the French defense is, it's very, very simple. We don't occupy the center directly because we start with e6 to prepare for playing d5 afterwards. Here, everyone plays d4. Why? Because they take advantage of the fact that we haven't occupied the center to take it themselves with their two pawns, all right? And that's the correct way to continue. As long as they occupy the center, placing both pawns fully centralized, notice that both of their bishops can develop well and both knights also have a wonderful position. And here we're going to play d5. Up to this point, we have the French defense. It's really just that simple. However, in this particular case, there are actually 4 main variations, which we're going to carefully narrow down to just 3. And I'm going to explain them to you in such a simple way that you'll be able to play them without any problem at all. Without having studied entire books on the French defense, simply by watching this video from start to finish. So, if this video gets 300 likes, I'll make the same kind of video with the defense or opening of your choice. Just let me know in the comments. So let's get started. What options does white have here? Well, first I'll explain it to you. I'll tell you what options there are, and then we'll go through them one by one. The main one, and the one you're almost always going to face, is this one here, the advanced variation. 5, right? Why? Because here white gets a lot of space and we end up with much less. Now I'm going to show you how to counterattack and how to play against that, because we have some spectacular plans. The other variation would simply be the exchange variation. What happens if they capture this pawn here, and how should we play? And finally, the Tarrasch variation, or the line with knight to c3 and knight to d2, which honestly doesn't matter to us because we're going to play the same way, and it's very straightforward. So come on, let's get to it. Let's get ready for the rodeo. Put your boots on, because we're going to start directly with the advanced variation. Perhaps the most played variation. That said, you shouldn't overlook any of the variations, because if you study one more than the others, your opponent might play a different variation and you'll end up worse off. All right, the most popular one, the advanced variation. What are we going to do when they play against us? This advance right here? Well, our plan, which most of you probably know, but if not, I'll explain it, is very simple. It's to fight against this pawn here. This pawn on d4 is white's main favorite because it's the one holding the position together. Take a good look. If this pawn disappears, just look. What a weakness they have here. We would most likely end up winning it. So we simply start with c5 whenever they play the advanced variation against us. Right here, in this situation, they really only have one strong move, and that move is c3. Defending this point. If they defend it with another piece, like the knight for example, we simply take pawn for pawn. That would give us a quite significant and notable advantage, since now this pawn is going to be very hard to defend. And indeed, we're going to have a tremendous initiative to attack with our knights, even here and here with the queen. They are practically never going to be able to defend it unless they seriously weaken themselves with this pawn. So here, they only have one good move when we make this move. c5, which is c3. Up to this point, everything is correct. How should we continue? Well, we simply continue with knight to c6, which is the main idea of the French defense. Advanced variation, remember well, attack this point here. We're putting pressure on this point. Perfect. Our opponent is logically going to play the best move, which is knight to f3. They develop a knight and defend the d4 point. I'm telling you, don't worry if they don't play this against you. I'm giving you the best variation for white, because from here on, if you use this plan against a weaker variation for white, you'll end up even better off. Even better. All right, so stay calm. Very well, knight to f3. And here we're simply going to play knight to e7, and I'm going to explain why. If someone tries to be clever and defends this point with f4, then you'll play knight to h6. It's an ideal plan. Why? Because now this bishop can't be exchanged for this knight, and therefore we won't have to double our pawns. And on top of that, this knight will have a spectacular square. On f5, it would attack this d4 square, which is exactly what we want, remember? However, we're only going to do this if they play f4. Notice that if they play the normal move, knight to f3, we will develop this knight from g to e7. Why? Because if we develop it over here, they would exchange, and we would end up with doubled pawns. On the other hand, from here, it's already aiming again at the f5 square to come and attack this point. Pay close attention. You need to understand something very important whenever they play the advanced variation against you. We have a good bishop and a bad bishop. All right, this bishop is the bad one. Why? Simply because it's blocked by our own pawn structure. This bishop is good, even though it seems like it doesn't have many possible developments. However, you'll see, next that this bishop will be very useful in the opening. That said, it's important. First, develop this knight, because if we develop the bishop first, notice that this knight can't come out here, here, or here, because the bishop is in the way. So this is extremely important. First, bring this knight out to e7, okay? Very well. Our opponent can continue with many ideas. They can develop this bishop, which is the most common move to be able to castle quickly. Simply, if they play, for example, bishop to d3, which is not the move I'm going to recommend to you, what should you do? Well, simply pawn takes pawn, and start putting pressure on this d4 square. I'm telling you, it's going to be a headache for your opponents to defend this point, all right? So let's suppose here, instead of placing the bishop blocking the queen's defense, they put it on e2, which might be a slightly more precise move. In that case, we're simply going to do the same thing. We're going to capture. You can see that it's very easy to play if you really understand the concepts. I'm going to put all my effort into explaining it in a way that all of you will be able to understand it right away. And even if it's not the first time, just by watching this video as many times as you need, you'll be able to play it perfectly. Perfect. We exchange these pawns when they develop the bishop. Remember this well. First we develop the knights, and then we exchange here. With what idea? Well, simply knight to f5. Notice that we're doing the same thing over and over. For now, notice one thing. We're attacking this pawn with 2 pieces, and they defend it with 2. So for now, there's no need to worry. If they simply play a move here like castling, what we're going to do is keep putting pressure on this point with queen to b6. And as you can see, all the moves here are already starting to become dangerous for white. Notice that unless they play perfectly, this is what's good about this defense, unless they play perfectly, our pressure is going to be overwhelming. Here we already have a fairly significant advantage. Now we're attacking this point with 3 pieces, and there's no satisfactory way to defend it. Because surely you all see that the only way to defend the d4 point is bishop to e3. And bishop to e3 has a serious problem. It gives up a pawn. Which pawn is being given up? This pawn on b2. As you can see, it's giving up this pawn. They should develop this knight. We're still attacking this point. That is, here, after the move queen to b6, we're attacking this d4 point too much, and things are getting really complicated for the white pieces. In other words, let's take a move back for a moment. When we play knight to f5, they have to be very precise in their response, okay? They can't just play castling or make a move that doesn't make any sense at all in this position. Every move matters here, and any careless decision could create serious problems for white, so they need to be extremely careful. Because then we'll simply play queen to b6, and we're going to gobble up that pawn. And let me tell you something, once you take that pawn, which you'll manage to do in many of your games, what's going to happen? Not only will you have an extra pawn, but you're going to blow your opponent's entire position wide open, because now this pawn, which is currently well defended, will no longer be so well protected. And the position will be so easy for you to play that you'll achieve great success. Now then, what move should they play instead of castling? Well, here they have several possible moves. The main and best one is knight to c3. And I'm going to explain why. The good thing about this defense is that you have to find the precise moves, just as I'm telling you. Now, when we use the move queen to b6 to keep attacking, you might say, come on, Chestershire, we're in the same situation as before. This pawn is being attacked by 3 pieces, and it's not easy to defend either. In fact, the only move they have is bishop to e3, and exactly the same thing would happen again. I could even exchange knight for bishop, pawn takes bishop, and queen takes b2, winning a pawn again. However, here you shouldn't play bishop to e3, but rather knight to c3 was to set up the move. Knight to a4, the only move that saves white. Notice that it's already getting complicated. King to f1 would also save them to avoid possible checks later on. However, I doubt your opponent will play king to f1 in your games, since they'd be giving up castling. And if your opponent is really, really good, maybe they'll play it. In fact, if your opponent is really, really good, you can relax, because they're probably going to play this or something similar. Or another move, they're going to put pressure on you, for sure, okay? Here, the correct and most commonly played move is knight to a4. Why? Because we're still attacking this point with 3 pieces, but at the same time, we're being attacked the queen, so we have to prioritize defending the queen. What are we going to do? We're simply going to give a check. How? Queen to a5, check. Careful, because we're threatening this check. The queen has already moved away from the threat, and now they have to block the check. If, for example, they play bishop to d2, we would simply bring our bishop, and notice that after the exchanges, because if not, we would exchange ourselves and end up capturing this pawn here. Pay close attention. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, and it doesn't matter if it's knight takes queen or king takes queen, this pawn would be left completely undefended. Therefore, it's normal for them to be the ones to exchange. Once they exchange, we simply capture with the queen, check, and then we will capture either this pawn here or this pawn over here. So notice that it seems bishop to d2 doesn't work to block the check. And it's a move that seems super interesting. Also notice here that if we play bishop takes and queen takes, they're also leaving this knight here undefended. So final summary. If we play queen to a5, the only move they have is knight to c3, bringing the knight back. All right, so what should we do if they play correctly and bring the knight back? Well, it's very simple. We'll move the queen back to b6 and we'll have this attack here. If you see that they get stubborn and try to do the same thing again, you have 2 options. Either go for a draw if your opponent is stronger, then you can simply repeat moves here and get a draw. Or perhaps try to be a bit more aggressive. And what is the more aggressive option? Well, instead of moving the queen away to give check, you come and give check directly with the bishop. With what result? Now simply, when they block, which now they can, we play queen to a5 because we have to move the queen. Make sure to remember this, okay? They're attacking our queen. Giving checks is one thing, but giving away the queen is another, right? Very well, we move it away and put pressure here. When they castle, no matter what they do, simply bishop takes, and after knight takes, queen takes. If they play queen takes, we exchange queens, and if they play knight takes, we capture here. In both variations, we end up with an extra pawn. Conclusion of this advanced variation. Very, very simple. As you have been able to see, our idea is to bring our pieces in to put pressure on the d4 square. Also, I have shown you how to play if your opponent makes the best moves. Now you're going to be super happy, because the first variation I showed you, which is the advanced variation, is perhaps the one with the most theory. And maybe it's the hardest to understand, although I think I've explained it in a simple way so that everyone can understand and apply it in your games. We have 2 variations left, the exchange variation and the knight variation. If you're faced with either of these 2 variations, you can be pretty relaxed. Just like with the advanced variation, you can also be at ease. If you know it, even more so, because we're simply going to recapture with the pawn. And attacking ideas are very difficult for the white pieces. Usually those who play the exchange variation play correctly. Knight to f3, to which we will respond symmetrically with knight to f6, bishop to d3, and we will respond symmetrically as well. Also with bishop to d6, because they play bishop to d3, it's very simple. Bishop to e2 would also be possible. However, this bishop doesn't really thrive over here. On the other hand, over here it points toward a possible castling. In fact, it can't come here, and not here either, because we would simply play rook to 6 and this bishop would have to retreat and they would have given us a tempo. That's why I don't dwell too much on this bishop to 3. Simply bishop to 6 is best for the same idea, right? It's the best position for this light squared bishop for white and for the dark squared bishop for us. Very well here. So how can the game continue? Well, with castling, right? If your opponent tries to play c4 first, I recommend that you capture this pawn and play against this isolated pawn. You should know that whenever there is a doubled queen's pawn, even though the French defense is an open king's pawn opening, in the exchange variation, it turns into a queen's pawn type of variation. You can already see that it's a doubled queen's pawn. Well, whenever you have a doubled queen's pawn structure, the c pawn is typically the one that is primarily responsible for unbalancing this doubled central pawn position. So when c4 is played, now I'm going to explain how you should play with pawn takes pawn. All right? It's very simple. If they don't play c4, then they can't really pose any problems for you, because notice, it's the only problem they can pose for you in this situation. Very well. If they castle, you just take your time, right? And when they play c4, pawn takes pawn. Very good. Why pawn takes pawn? It seems like we're improving this bishop, leaving them with a central pawn and us without one. Forgive me. Well, because now we're going to pose serious problems for our opponent. First, this is not a very well-known variation, and we're taking our opponent out of their comfort zone because they don't expect us to give up our central pawn for a side pawn. However, playing against an isolated pawn is very comfortable. For example, knight to c6, attacking this pawn. And many of you might say, come on, chess teacher, this move seems weak. We're allowing this pawn to advance under very good conditions. However, this doesn't bother us because we have good retreats for the knight. Knight to a5. In this case, attacking this bishop, and if it comes over here, we would simply exchange it. And on top of that, we would end up with a much better position thanks to having a good pair of bishops. Very well, so this bishop has to retreat, not here, because it would lose the pawn, so it must go to e2. And then here we have a rather surprising move, which is knight takes pawn. Notice how simple this was. If you didn't understand it, rewind the video. I don't want it to get too long. Why can we give up this knight? It's very simple. Now this knight can't be taken because then bishop takes discovered attack, check, and we'd snatch the queen. That's why we can simply capture this pawn here, right now, at this moment, without any problems at all. And here we'd end up with an extra pawn. Notice that they couldn't advance. This pawn here, why am I telling you this? Because notice that here, almost no one expects us to capture this pawn with the bishop and play against this isolated pawn. And when we attack here, honestly, a lot of people will make this advancing move, which is a small mistake. Thanks to knight to a5, attacking the bishop, and then being able to sacrifice this knight for a pawn, which actually isn't a real sacrifice because this knight can't be taken. What happens then? But what if they don't advance this pawn and they keep playing in a completely normal and calm way, like with knight to c3? Well, you really don't need to worry at all because here we have a super good position to play. Take a look. We have material equality, but our opponent has an isolated pawn, which is always a target for attack. So you'll have a super comfortable game. For example, if you do not want any kind of problems, you can play h6. And this bishop can no longer go anywhere important. For example, it can only come here. So you develop your bishop and you're going to play an extremely comfortable game where you'll be able to fight against this pawn here, thanks to the steady and consistent pressure from your pieces. So you'll actually want them to play this particular variation against you. When you finish this video and have studied it thoroughly and carefully, you'll really want to play the French defense because you'll be able to control all of your opponent's possible responses and you'll like all of them. And now we just have the last variation left, which is the knight variation. Both knight to c3 and knight to d2. I told you it was exactly the same because we were going to play pawn takes pawn, right? And now, what difference does it make if the knight is here or here? He must recapture this pawn and we would reach the same position. Notice what's great about this video. It's that simply by mastering these three variations, you can play forever. The French defense. From here, if you want, you can even expand your knowledge and study even more, right? But if you just study these three variations well with this video, believe me, you are going to play at a very high level. The French defense, which is a defense that gives spectacular results, even in slow tournament games. All right? Very good. Here, what are we going to play? Well, we simply develop with bishop to e7. Don't worry. This variation is very easy to play and you're going to love it. We develop this bishop to e7. They keep developing their pieces. Knight to f3. We play knight to f6. Here, they have two options, all right? They can exchange or let us exchange. If they exchange, great. Why? Because this bishop on f6 is going to become a great attacking machine, right? This bishop here defends the castling, points toward the queen side, and in the future, if we ever feel very concerned, we can always retreat the bishop this way and we'll have a super strong castling. And the other option is that, for example, they simply keep developing with bishop to e3, defend this knight, and then we will capture ourselves. All right? In both cases, don't worry, it's just like the first variation. These two variations, as well as the exchange and the two knights, are more theoretical and you need to understand the theoretical moves better. It really doesn't matter where they go. It's more about grasping the concepts, which are actually quite simple. If you manage to understand them, in this case, if you understand the opening better than your opponent, you're very likely to end up winning the game. We castle calmly. It really doesn't matter to us because what is our plan? Well, look, knight to d7 is much better than knight to c6. Let me explain why. If you don't understand this plan, you might be asking, why? Knight to d7? No, it's very simple. We just want to reposition it here, where this knight will be much better placed and will be aiming at the center. You already know that this knight here is the best defender of the castling, and on top of that, we would gain initiative. Knight to d7. I don't know. For example, rook to e1, just to say something, and then knight to f6. Very important. We attack this bishop, which has to retreat. Now we just need to develop this bishop, and notice that many of you might say, well, bishop to d7 already, but even better is b6, because we want to develop the bishop through here. Just look, what a wonderful position. This bishop in fianchetto is spectacular. This bishop is super solid. We have our pieces very solid. We're not going to leave anything hanging, and they're very well placed. b6. Our opponent, for example, might play c3, which is a very good move to support this d4 square, which, as you know, can sometimes become very weak, as we've seen before. Bishop to b6, and here, for example, queen to c2. Attacking here would already be a mistake, because simply with the bishop on b6, we could always open up the king. So here they should be a bit more careful. When instead of queen to c2, for example, they might play bishop to f4. How are we going to continue? Well, the plan from now on is very simple. The bishop, although it's blocking here, we could even come in through here, attacking with a lot of force. The bishop here becomes even more passive. Here, it doesn't attack anything at all, because this pin is defended by the bishop on e7. We can even attack this bishop, and it doesn't matter to us. So the strongest move is bishop to f4. And here we're simply going to exchange these bishops. If it retreats, it's going to lose a tempo, because now we're attacking over here. c5, queen, c7. We bring in a lot of force. We attack here, right? So the normal thing here is for them to capture the bishop logically, and here you have two options. Capture with the queen or capture with the pawn. I recommend capturing with the queen, because this pawn can always come to c5 and attack a lot. And notice that this is quite a solid position. So you understand, as I said here, you shouldn't memorize moves, just the first ones. But above all, the ideas. Let's continue with a real game so you can see how this type of opening can proceed. This is extremely important, because this way you'll have a real example of how to play in your own games. For example, here, white played knight to e5, greatly improving this knight. And as I just mentioned, c5 is a fundamental move. Why? Because it develops, well, not develops, but puts pressure on the center, with this c-pawn. As I always say, it's so important to act against this pawn here. Right now, pawn takes pawn is being threatened, and even though it wouldn't work at this moment, look closely. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn. That would be a mistake, because simply bishop takes h7, check, a discovered attack, and we would lose the queen. Simply pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn. We wouldn't capture here. We would play something else, like, for example, moving the king or something like that, and this pawn would be isolated. That's why they capture here. Once they capture here, the player with the black pieces, instead of recapturing, played queen to e5. Queen to e5 is a very strong move, because it prepares to recapture whenever they want, but it also threatens checkmate. That's why you have to be super alert. White played queen to f3, and black simply ruined the opponent's pawn structure. How? Queen takes queen, knight takes, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. And now what they've done after these exchanges is ruin and play against the solidity of our pawn structure. As you know, not long ago, I think it was 2 days ago, I uploaded a video that I 100% recommend if you want to improve your chess level, about how to play well, your pawn structure, and how this will bring you many victories. And the game ended quickly, pawn takes pawn. If you want, finish watching this game and then go check out the other video that I'll leave for you in the description. White attacked the rook. Take a close look at this way of winning. He puts pressure on the b file and simply needs to play b3. Instead of capturing this bishop, which would fix the opponent's pawn structure, he plays knight to h4. Why? Because he wants to go for knight to f4 and improve the position of this knight, which can still become stronger and stronger. Rook to d1, rook to d8, facing off the rooks on open files. c4, I'll go through this part quickly because it's not important. f5, putting pressure on this bishop, which has to move, and now knight to f4. And he has a pretty comfortable game. Black, they're going to improve their kings, right? Notice that both are maneuvering. He has to try to do something, for example. Sorry. Here he played this first, although it doesn't really matter, because after the exchanges, he gave this check to the white king. He has to move. And now watch closely how black starts to apply pressure. This position is completely won. And whatever white does, look, here he stops any possible counterplay. He comes to exchange here. And it's clear that this position is just too easy for the black pieces to squeeze. Just look. Check on g2. The king has to move to a dark square so it doesn't get in the way. The bishop and the black king break through as much as they want. And this position is completely won. Once you have your opponent's pieces tied down, you use your own pieces to go for the win. The pawns, notice here that this pawn is going to be won, no matter how much they try to defend it. Why? Because the king was also responsible for defending this bishop. And this is a completely one-pawn endgame for black. Why? Because the king is much more active. I won't dwell on this any longer, just watch, I'll go through it quickly. Here, black simply manages to win with great ease. White will never be able to promote a pawn, not even close. Look at how much they still have to do, and black would have more than enough time to promote. So I hope you really enjoyed this video on the French defense. If you've made it to the end, please, I'm kindly asking you, leave a like. It costs you absolutely nothing, and share it with your friends so you can all become even better players and help each other out. So this defense is truly one of my favorites. I hope I've explained it wonderfully so that everyone understood me, and I hope you'll put it into practice. See you tomorrow, friends, in another new video. Goodbye.